Hi guys, and welcome to episode 2 of the Brighton Jazz School podcast. Thanks for joining us. We're now available on iTunes, so you have the ability now to subscribe to our weekly podcast so that it gets sent directly to your inbox. So rather than having to find it yourself, it will just be automatically delivered there. So the link is up on the brightonjazzschool.com/podcast website, so you can find there. Please subscribe, comments, leave ratings, leave us a review. That would be much appreciated. Okay, so we've got a really packed show for you today. First of all, we have local singer, well, I say local, but she's really performed and sang all over the world, although she does live in Brighton. Her name is Heather Cairncross, and she's an absolutely fantastic singer. In my view, one of the fast up-and-coming jazz singers on the UK scene. I've had the privilege of playing for Heather quite a few times, and every time just really is an absolute experience. She's open to things going in any direction, and she's really a great listener, so it's always very exciting performing with her. So we have her in the studio for a guest artist interview, and we're also going to feature one of her tracks from her most recent album, At Last. You can get that from her website, which details are coming up later on. The album of the week this week is the Tony Bennett-Bill Evans album Together, recorded in 1975. And the reason I've chosen that this week is because Heather mentions it in her interview. It's always been an album that I've loved since way back. One of my piano teachers, Chris Ingham, introduced it to me as a lesson in how to accompany a singer. So I really studied that album, the way Bill Evans comps behind Tony Bennett. And similarly, the way Tony Bennett just conveys the story. You know, he really gets to the bottom of each song and sings them so beautifully. And sometimes he's almost speaking the words, sort of saying the lyrics. And the way he can do that is really quite amazing. They did another album called Together Again in 1977, which is just as good. And Spotify have just put up the reissue. Both albums were reissued, and they contain many unreleased tracks, and that's up on Spotify. So again, I'll put the link up on there. It's really worth checking out. So we've got the tip of the week as well, and as I said, we'll finish out with Heather's version of The Very Thought of You from her brand new album called At Last. Welcome to Album of the Week. Over the past week I've been revisiting an album that I fell in love with years ago, and it's called Together, and it's by pianist Bill Evans and the singer Tony Bennett. Recorded in 1975, they went on to record another album called Together Again in 1977. They both went out on Fantasy Records, and in 2009 they released additional tracks in a double box set called The Complete Tony Bennett and Bill Evans Recordings, and that's also available on Spotify, so I really urge you to check that out. There's some great additional tracks there, alternative takes that are really worth listening to. For me, it's an absolutely textbook example on how to accompany a singer. Tony Bennett displays a masterful approach in his ability to convey the emotional and lyrical content of the song. Like I said, without any forced or inappropriate drama, everything is very subtle, which suits Bill Evans' playing down to a T. Bill is able to conjure up all these exotic reharmonizations of fairly familiar standards, and they just turn them into absolute gems. Each track, there's not one bad track on there at all. I can listen to this album over and over again. They kick off with Young and Foolish, which is an absolutely gorgeous rendition, really lush piano voicings, complex harmonizations, and just the telling of the story. The next track is The Touch of Your Lips by Ray Noble, which is just simply stunning. Some Other Time, which is the next track by Leonard Bernstein. Apparently Bill Evans came up with the improvisation Peace, which is just a very simple chord sequence in the key of C. It's just 2 diatonic chords, and Bill Evans made a whole piece out of this, and he sort of explores the different modal areas of C major with some Lydian scales and some unexpected notes which don't technically fit in the key of C, but they offer up a sort of light and shade bit of dissonance which Kind of reminds me of some of the Eric Satie pieces, so check that out if you haven't heard that. Then they play a Cy Coleman tune called When in Rome, followed by a great version of We'll Be Together Again. Then they play the last 3 tracks, which I really think are the highlight of the album. My Foolish Heart, which is just an absolutely gorgeous melody, and it's often associated with Bill Evans, that tune. Then plays an original, Waltz for Debbie, which now is pretty much a jazz standard. And then they finish off with a song that's often associated with Evans called But Beautiful. And of course Evans recorded that on his solo piano album called Alone. And if you haven't heard that, really check it out. One of the main reasons I've chosen this album as Album of the Week is that it ties in really well with Heather Cairncross's interview. I've had so many conversations with Heather about this album, how important it is. And it just so happens that her latest album, called At Last, available from heathercairncross.com, is exactly in the same format. It's piano and voice, featuring the amazing Dave Newton. I think he's won UK Jazz Pianist of the Year about 6 million times. Just great piano player. Check him out on this album. I think it's some of his best playing, and I didn't realise how good Dave was at accompanying singers, and this is a really great album. But don't take my word for it. Hang around to the end, listen to the track that we've selected to play to you directly off this album, and if you like it, please, which I know you will, please go to heathercairncross.com and buy it. Show your love for Heather. And I know Heather would say show your love for Tony Bennett and Bill Evans by checking out this album. It's an absolute gem, a real classic album in jazz. Not only this one, but their follow-up album in '74 called Together Again. You know, like I said, absolute textbook example on how to deliver, execute, and communicate beautiful melodies from the American songbook. I can't say enough about it. Check it out. It's very easy to do. It's been re-released on a 2-CD box set that's now available on Spotify. And, you know, so you can have it on your computer right now. And I really do hope you invest the time in checking it out. Talk about it on the Brighton Jazz School forum. Let me know what you think about it. You know, have I got it wrong? Have I completely overestimated this? I really don't think I have. But, of course, you're entitled to your opinions, and I'd be really happy to read them and fascinated by other opinions on this album. So please log in and let me know what you think. Hi guys, and welcome to the Brighton Jazz School Artist Interview. Today we're very lucky to be joined by Heather Cairncross, fantastic singer, and quite often featured here at the Brunswick, and just like to welcome you and thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're very welcome.
How did you get started in music? What was the catalyst for you to enter the world of music?
Well, right from a very young age, I used to string up sheets in my mum's living room and put on shows, force her to, you know, enroll all my friends to come round and take part. I would always have the lead part. Mm-hmm. And I took up playing the flute quite late, when I was about 14. And when it came to the point of going to sixth form college to do A-levels, I didn't want to go to the local sixth form college because I'd still have to do games. And so I decided I'd be very glamorous and go to Chichester College, where they had a music course. And I went and auditioned as a flute player. And because I didn't play the piano at the time, I did singing as a second study, because I used to do the all the school shows and things. Yeah. And I went along and they said, well, your flute playing's okay, but we've got some really good flute players. But we quite like your singing. Do you want to do singing? So I thought, oh yeah, okay, just anything to not have to go to do games. And yeah, and did 2 years doing my A-levels, and didn't really ever think I was going to do it for a living. It was just I did music A-level. I did maths as well. But then when I was there, my singing teacher suggested I auditioned for music college. Well, I didn't really know what that was, but I thought, day in London, okay. And by some miracle, I managed to get into a couple of music colleges, and I went to the Guildhall for 4 years. That's where I did my training.
Yeah, not a bad place to accidentally go to.
Apparently, I did my audition, and there was a chap there who's very high up in the leader world, in German, called Rudolf Pierney, and I sang for an audition piece, He Was Despised from the Messiah, in what I thought was my best alto voice. And he leaned forward and said, do you do shows? So he could even hear then in my what I thought was my best classical voice that I did shows, school shows.
Yeah, sure.
That's because of the damage I'd done to my voice
Right.
at that point by singing in Bognor Regis holiday camps.
Wow. Okay, great. And how did you particularly get into jazz? I mean, you sing with such control, which is obviously a result of your extensive classical training, but you really, as well as that, you have a deep love and that comes through in a real natural sense of time for jazz. When did that all come about, and how?
Thank you. I always sang in bands. I think basically most of the music I like to listen to is I love people like Stevie Wonder. I'll confess now, Luther Vandross,
Wow,
George Benson, all those sort
Great.
of people, all those sort of smooth soul singers.
Yeah.
But also always loved Ella, Billie Holiday, all the usual suspects.
Yeah.
But when I went to Guildhall, I wasn't actually allowed to sing any jazz for the first 3 years because they had to sort of try and repair the damage I'd done to my voice.
Really?
I wasn't allowed to sing below middle C for 3 years.
Really?
Because I just overdeveloped the bottom of my voice.
Wow.
And then I was allowed to sing with the Guildhall Big Band, but just that was the only thing I was allowed to do. I wasn't allowed to do anything else.
Wow.
And then not long after I left Guildhall, I got into a group called the Swingle Singers, which I was with them for 10 years, and that was a fantastic training in recording mainly, very precision, a cappella singing 8 parts with no instruments, and that sort of gave it. That was a crossover group. They did classical things, but they also did jazz stuff then as well. But always for pleasure, I would listen to jazz.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, and it's now sort of later in my career that I've been fortunate enough to meet up with some wonderful people who've encouraged me and sort of got quite seriously into it now.
Yeah.
But I still do a lot of classical. I mean, classical and baroque music is what I do mostly, and recording. But I tend to get work because I can do different styles. They know that if they get me along for 3 hours and they want somebody to sound classical or sound like a choir boy or sound jazzy or gospely or whatever, I can usually make that sound.
You can do it all. Fantastic. Well, that's great. And you've recently released an album, brand new.
Yes, with David Newton, who's just won Best Pianist,
the
British Jazz Awards for the 10th time.
10th time.
Much to the annoyance of a lot of other people. But it's very coincidentally good for our marketing strategy.
Yeah. Well, he's a great. I've followed him for quite a number of years and got quite a few of his albums, and I mean, this album is just stunning.
Do you like it?
I love it.
Great.
It's really good, and just it sort of reminds me of that Bill Evans album with Tony Bennett. The
Together.
The interplay. The interplay that you have with Dave and the way in which you approach those songs.
It was a really interesting couple of days. I mean, I didn't know how long it would take or what form. I just went along. He wouldn't really tell me which keys he wanted to do charts in, so I ended up going every song I put on Sibelius. I printed out 4 or 5 different keys because I was very aware that when we put the album together, I couldn't have all the same keys in a row. So as we were going along, I think, okay, well, I've got 2 in C major now. I need to do something in B flat or a different key. But we took the decision. The album's called At Last because of the song At Last is on it, but also because I've been in the business 25 years and I've never really done a solo album, so it seemed appropriate. In fact, some other friend has dubbed it about beep time. And when somebody very nicely, after I did a Stelling Jazz Club gig, offered to pay for an album for me, I did the gig, and I had to announce in the interval that the pianist, the drummer and the bass player all had an album for sale, and it was my gig and I didn't have one. And somebody came up to me afterwards and said, why haven't you got an album? And I sort of explained it was a matter of money, and anyway, he offered to pay for the album. So then I had a real difficult choice of what to do, and what seemed very important to me was just to get it done, because when you start sort of thinking, I've got to do this great enormous project, and I've got to come up with really groundbreaking arrangements, and do something with all the people I've ever worked with, all the wonderful people, it sort of stops you starting. So I just thought, okay, what I'm going to do is book Dave, and we'll go and do 2 days and record in the same room. And what I would try to do, and what we did in fact do, is to do everything in one take. So that I would use all the years of training I've had and all the different projects I've done, and try and use where I'd got to in my career, and just try and strip the songs back and be ever so honest in the way I sang. And that's what we tried to do. And we came away, we did 18 songs in 2 days, and the producer, who was Andy Kleinhart, the bass player, he sent me 53 takes, entire takes.
Wow.
4 or 5 of some songs. Every single one was completely different. I sometimes we get halfway through, and then David would stop and say, "Oh no, I didn't like that," and I'd say, "Well, I love the bit you did at the bridge," and he went, "Oh, what was that?" He could not remember. And every time we started a song, he just would have a completely different approach, and therefore, and I tried to just relax into it and just to go with whatever he was, this sort of wonderful tapestry canvas that he was giving me, and to just try and respond to that. Sure.
Well, for me, then, that's what I love so much about the album, is that it sounds very relaxed and like you said, honest. It just sounds like two musicians who have worked and had a lot of experience in different settings, and you've just come together through the love of these tunes, and it's really, blossomed into this fantastic end result. And where can we get it? Do you have a website?
At the moment you can get it at heathercairncross.com.
Okay.
And there's a very large buy the album banner on every page. We've just today actually signed a distribution deal with Proper Note Records, who distribute people like ECM and and so I think we've got our launch party on March the 21st.
Great.
So you can get it on my on my website now, and you can download it. And there's also, if you download it there, you get some extra tracks that are not on the CD.
Very nice. Yeah.
And also, if you join up to the mailing list there, you get another extra track, songs that really I would have put on the album, but we just didn't have time enough on the album because we had something like 87 minutes of music in the end. So.
Maybe a box set in the pipeline then.
Well, it's obviously Together and Together Again.
Yes,
the
of course.
Bill Evans albums. So you can get it there, but then it will be available on the 21st in iTunes and HMV, all those places, Amazon stuff. So
great, fantastic. Okay, well, I think we just sort of rounding up. I asked all my guests so far to give us. This is the difficult bit. An improvisation tip of the week. It doesn't necessarily have to be related specifically to improvising, but a bit of advice for fellow jazz students, that maybe they can take away and use in their own playing.
It's interesting because I teach quite a lot of people classical technique, and also some people come to me to learn to sing jazz, which is quite a hard thing to teach. And I would say that the most important thing to be a good jazz singer is to have a really strong internal pulse. Yeah. And to be able to sing behind the beat or ahead of the beat and then to catch up, you have to have such a strong regular pulse going on inside you. And then that makes people feel comfortable if you sing the time differently because they're confident that you know where the time is. Yeah. So I think it's a good idea to practice with a metronome. Sure. And get the metronome so that it plays like minims. So if you're in a 4/4 bar, that it would play every other beat, and then imagine that it's playing 2 and the 4. So it's a really basic thing, but it's a really good way to practice your song absolutely on the beat with the metronome playing on the 2 and the 4, but then practice going a little bit slower and a little bit faster. So that's one thing to do. Great. The only improvising. If you're going to improvise, choose a song that you really know the chords well.
Yeah, yeah.
Because, especially for a singer, you can't just look at a B-flat chord and play a scale that you've practiced.
Exactly.
You have to respond to what you can hear orally. And try and leave lots of space. That's a good thing. Maybe start off actually singing a bit of the tune before you go off the tune.
Yeah, that's great.
And if you ever get lost in it, just get back onto the tune again.
Always have
and then
the tune
come
as a
off.
reference. Yeah, that's great. That's great. And this is a really interesting thing with singers. Different singers pull the tune, the melody around, in different ways. Can you recommend one that you've particularly latched onto and listened to? I mean, or you do? Is it? How have you come up with your concept of interpreting tune? I know that's a massive
I think
question,
you need to speak the words.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
So speak them as if it was a poem, as if you were, or as if you were trying to explain what you really felt to somebody.
Yeah.
So when you sing, you should try and sing as if you're having those thoughts for the first time. So you wouldn't hold the notes for. I mean, I do sometimes hold the notes for a long time, but to get that jazz feel, you've got to make it very conversational.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
say the words to yourself rather than learning the tune and with the words. Yes, do that, learn the tune, but then say it as if you were just saying a poem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's great, actually. There's lots and lots of people who have said very similar things, instrumentalists as well, and certainly when we listen to the grand masters of jazz, it does sound like they're having conversations. So
I mean, the master of that towards the end of his career is called Frank Sinatra.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, he doesn't really sing much at all.
No.
He just... He almost speaks it, and I think that's another really important thing, is to find the good key for you, which is close to your speaking voice, to where the main body of the song is. Yeah, you would speak it.
Right. Okay, that's great, brilliant. Thanks, Heather. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and it is a pleasure to play for you occasionally and to listen to you. And if you haven't heard Heather, please get down to the Brunswick. She's not always there, but she's there's a good chance you'll
Sometimes
catch her.
She's just there drinking.
She loves the social aspect of jazz.
The social aspect of jazz.
But do check her out, heathercairncross.com, and we look forward to the second half of the album, maybe in the not too distant future. But Get At Last, it really is fantastic.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hi guys, and welcome to the Student Information Area. This week we're looking at the very basic elements of jazz. What makes up this music? How's it put together? A lot of it has to do with the very beginning, the birth of the music back in New Orleans. Let's have a look at the elements that were around then. So we've got the blues, we've got swing, and I don't mean the style, but I mean the groove. Later on we've got bebop, and then we've got the classical influence, so the romantic, baroque and modern period of classical music that was brought to jazz through the Creoles in New Orleans. Now, bebop was a style that developed later on, but it's absolutely the architecture of modern jazz, so we cannot ignore that. Of course, there are other elements that influence jazz and shape jazz, such as Latin and the fusion styles fused with rock and funk and disco. That came much later on. So we're going to concentrate on those four. Now, for me, jazz is very much a language, and I really believe that it should be learnt that way as well. If you can remember back to the very first words you said as a child, how did you get to those words? Did you learn to read them on the page first of all? No, of course not. You learn to copy them from probably your parents. And it's exactly the same thing in jazz. When you start out learning, you have to just copy. Choose your favourite player. Choose someone who's not too virtuosic and just copy them. Just copy some phrases. That's the only way to ingrain the feeling of this music, the jazz, the time feel. And it's exactly the same as a language. You learn a word, you copy a word, then you learn a sentence, then you learn a longer phrase, then you might learn, a paragraph. And then by the time you get to that point, you can start to string simple phrases together. And then, as we get older, our vocabulary becomes more sophisticated, as does our ability to string words and sentences together. So to the point that we're not thinking about what we're going to say. So we're improvising on the spot. We're not thinking about rules, we're not thinking about grammar, we're just saying what comes into our mind. And that is exactly what we should be trying to do with jazz. We're not trying to think of clever things, we're not trying to think of clever pre-learnt phrases. We're just simply trying to get the music that we're hearing in our head out. Quite often that's difficult, and at times we have to rely on things that we already know. For example, if we're playing at fast tempos, then we don't necessarily have the brain power to come up with original things all the time. So of course we have to rely on things that we already know as players. But we're trying to always expand those things that we know so that we don't repeat ourselves too much. Some repetition is good, don't get me wrong, but you don't want to sound like you're repeating yourself all the time. You want to sound like you have fresh new ideas and that they're just ready to come out and surprise your listener. So we can talk about some fairly non-technical things that we can do to try and draw the listener in during your solos. So here are a few tips. Before we get stuck in though, I really recommend you only think about one or two of these while you're practicing, and certainly never ever think about these when you're performing. When you're up on the bandstand, you don't want to be thinking about anything technical at all. You just want to be in the zone, in the moment, and not letting your mind get in the way. Okay, so here are the tips. Don't limit yourself to starting every phrase in the bottom register. Try and utilize both ascending and descending motion. So really, really simple. Just don't play the same shapes all the time. Vary them, and also vary the range of which you play them. So, start by playing higher up in your instrument's range, lower down. Really try and use the whole range of your instrument to sustain that interest. Vary your articulation. Use staccato, legato. Just try and really just vary that, but in a musical way. What we don't want to hear is, a couple of legato phrases, and then we don't want to hear your mind going, okay, and now I'm running out of ideas, so here comes a staccato phrase. We don't want it drived. We want it nice and smooth. Here's a very simple one. Vary the dynamics. It's quite often we can forget about playing loud and soft. It's a very simple thing, but very, very effective. Try and vary that in your solo as well. It will give shape to your solo and contour, and it will again have more musical meaning to your listener. Make sure that all the scales, all the technicalities are memorized, so you must know what the chords are, you must know what the melody is. Try and learn the lyrics as well if you can, and you must know all the scales and the implications that go with the chords. So have a rough map in your head. You don't want to be thinking about scales when you're improvising, but you need to know what they are. You need to know what notes you can play. So that's a very basic one. It's an obvious one, but it's quite often overlooked. You come up to a chord, and it's almost like you're stuck. You're not quite sure what scale to use. There's no time for that. You have to know what notes to play. You don't necessarily have to know what you're going to play, but you really need to give yourself as much information as you can, and this will give you as much freedom to improvise as you can, and that's what we're looking for. Always try to mentally hear the note before you play it. Always try to mentally hear the note before you play it. Now, ear training will help with that, and if you come to the Learn to Play class, then I hope you're practicing the ear training exercises that we do. But if you don't hear it, don't play it. It's as simple as that. We don't want your fingers just to run up and down the keys or run up and down your instrument. You've really got to make every note count. If you didn't intend to play it, then don't play it. Try to make the notes that you play have a sense of direction. Think about tension and release. Think in 2, 6 or 8 bar phrases to develop an idea. Now that does link in with what we did last week in the student section where I talked about melodic development. Please go back and revisit that podcast if you can. Always think about developing your ideas. Here's another simple one. Listen to what you play. Do you like your sound? Are you in tune? Make a big effort to make yourself and your listeners love your sound. If you don't love your sound, then you're not going to convey whatever you have to say, no matter how much technique you have or no matter how much music you have inside of you. If you don't like the way you sound, you're never going to come across in a confident manner. So make sure you love your sound. If you don't practice your sound until you like it. And tuning is an obvious one, but again, many great jazz musicians are simply out of tune. So work on your tuning, make sure that that's all fine. Now, I've left this one to the last because it's one of the most important one, if not the most important one. Make sure you listen to other members in the group. You've got to have dialogue. You've got to respond to what they do. Have musical conversations. This is absolutely essential to jazz, and it's one of the driving forces behind what makes this music exciting and edgy. In the Learn to Play class now, I've banned everybody from pre-knowing who's going to be taking a solo next, because up until that point many of the groups were already deciding who's going to solo next, and you want to let that happen naturally. It gives it the edge. It gives the music that excitability, and that's what we want. So never really, if you can, try not to decide who's going to be soloing. Never decide a soloing order. Just let it happen. Whoever wants that first solo is just going to jump in and take it. And then you have to change the way you play, given that circumstance. So really let the music evolve naturally, and let each and every one of the group members, the band members, have their own voice. It's exactly what this music is for. In the Learn to Listen class this week, we're carrying on with bebop, and we're looking at, in particular, 3 or 4 musicians that really kind of got thrown by the wayside in terms of the history books around bebop. So we're talking about Oscar Pettiford, the bass player, Max Roach, the drummer, another fantastic drummer called Kenny Clark, and we're looking at what their contributions were to the music. So if you want to find out more, or even better, if you want to join us on the Learn to Listen class, then here are the details. It's a weekly class every Thursday from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m, and we run it at the Brunswick in one of the upstairs rooms. It's £6 a session, and they're really, really quite small classes, very, very nice people, and we just listen to a lot of great music and discuss the music. There's a weekly handout that's an in-depth look at some of the pioneers of jazz. It just really is a fun environment to listen to music and to share the experience with other people. So feel free to join us. Go to the Brighton Jazz School website, and you can even pay online, or you can pay on a weekly basis, entirely up to you. Here we are with Track of the Week. We're almost at the end of the show, but I'd just like to thank you for joining us. Thank you to Heather Cairncross for the fantastic interview. Thank you as ever to the Brunswick, to Mike Guest, who produces this podcast and edits it. Please, please, please click on subscribe. This is a weekly podcast. It's absolutely fascinating for me to be doing this, and I hope you join me each week with a new guest, a new track of the week, a new improvisation tip. What more could you want in a podcast? It's not just for people in Brighton, but it's for anyone interested in jazz across the globe. Join in the community, post questions at brightonjazzschool.com, and I'd be so happy to hear from you. In the meantime, I'm going to leave you with this track by Heather Cairncross from her latest album, At Last, which is, of course, available from heathercairncross.com, and this is her rendition of The Very Thought of You, featuring Dave Newton on piano. Thanks again, and join me next week on the Brighton Jazz School podcast. But for now, this is Wayne McConnell signing off.
The very thought of you, and I forget to do the little ordinary things that everyone ought to do. I'm living in a kind of daydream. I'm happy as a king, and foolish though it may seem to me, that's everything. The mere idea of you, the longing here for you. You'll never know how slow the moments go till I'm near to you. I see your face in every flower, your eyes in stars above. It's just the thought of you, the very thought of you, my love. The mere idea of you, the longing here for you. You'll never know how slow the moments go till I